The American Civil War was not just a domestic struggle. It was a global spectacle that captivated, divided, and confounded nations across the Atlantic. As the Union and Confederacy clashed on bloody battlefields, the world watched with bated breath, its own interests and ideologies tangled in the conflict. In London's corridors of power and Paris's imperial salons, leaders weighed the risks of intervention against the potential rewards of reshaping a fractured America. Would Britain and France tip the scales of war through diplomacy? Could economic pressures, humanitarian arguments, or political ambitions sway their neutrality? The answers were as complex as the war itself, revealing a web of economic dependencies, moral dilemmas, and geopolitical calculations. This is the story of how the world reacted to America's most defining conflict. A tale of cautious statesmen, strategic gambles, and a war whose reverberations extended far beyond its borders. But before we begin, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel to support our community. As the American Civil War raged in 1862, determining the Union's fate through battles, statesmen in London and Paris deliberated whether diplomacy should forge or fracture a nation. Since the previous year's war scare, when a Union vessel intercepted Confederate envoys, Britain and France had maintained cautious neutrality. By summer, however, political figures in both countries were growing increasingly uneasy. The Union blockade, combined with Confederate ambitions to exert economic pressure, had nearly halted the flow of cotton to Europe. Half of Britain's textile workers were jobless, and a third of its mills had shut down. "We are almost out of cotton, and cotton we must have," lamented the French foreign minister. Beyond economic concerns, many were horrified by the unrelenting bloodshed in what seemed an endless war. Others, more detached, simply hoped that dividing the Union would diminish the strength of America. Against this backdrop, the failure of McClellan's Peninsula Campaign reinforced the belief that the South could not be subdued militarily, suggesting that it was time for outside intervention. This intervention would take the form of mediation, spearheaded by Britain and France, which would likely result in Southern independence if accepted by Lincoln's administration. Support for such an approach undoubtedly existed in both London and Paris. Lord Palmerston, Britain's Prime Minister, was a staunch supporter of the Confederacy, while Napoleon III of France also leaned toward sympathy for the South. However, proposing mediation carried significant risks. If Washington outright rejected such an offer, Britain would lose considerable goodwill with the Americans without achieving anything in return. In retaliation, Britain might recognize Southern independence and dismantle the Union blockade. Yet Secretary of State Seward insisted that the conflict was merely an insurrection and warned that any recognition of the Confederacy would provoke war. These considerations created a complex dilemma for British leaders tasked with initiating mediation. Southern independence promised to alleviate the cotton shortage, halt the carnage, and weaken America's power. Yet even Palmerston doubted whether Jefferson Davis's fledgling nation was worth risking a war with the United States. The Confederacy could be besieging Washington, and it still wouldn't guarantee recognition, Palmerston bluntly told a Southern envoy. Timing was crucial. Mediation could only be offered when either the Union was too feeble to resist British pressure or Washington showed signs of seeking peace. As reports trickled in over subsequent weeks about Second Bull Run and General Lee's advance into Maryland, it appeared that moment had arrived. The Antietam campaign was likely the most perilous moment of the Civil War for the Union, surpassing even the Trent Affair a year earlier. Had Lee decisively defeated either Pope or McClellan, and if the congressional elections had turned against Lincoln, Britain would almost certainly have proposed mediation, something Washington would have found difficult to reject. In the absence of such events, however, Britain continued to waver. Despite Palmerston's bold rhetoric, he could only count on support from Gladstone, Russell, and Westbury for mediation. Confederate agents adeptly tailored their pitches to individual ministers. For instance, the Chancellor was assured that Richmond planned to align its currency more favorably with the pound. Yet a significant number of cabinet members sympathized with the North. This dynamic meant Palmerston had to tread carefully among his colleagues until the South achieved a major victory. While the Second Bull Run and the Confederate advance into Maryland were encouraging, they fell short of the decisive blow Palmerston believed necessary. Even so, these developments convinced him that intervention was becoming more plausible. On September 13th, Russell instructed Britain's ambassador in Paris to gauge French interest in jointly proposing an armistice. The plan included a threat that if rejected by the Union, Britain, France, and possibly Russia, Austria, and Italy might recognize Confederate independence. Although many believed the North was unlikely to subdue the South militarily, the British cabinet remained resistant to mediation without clear signs of interest from Washington. This position was reinforced by Paris's lukewarm response. Despite Napoleon III's sympathy for the South, his foreign minister argued that mediation required a strong peace party in the North to succeed. On September 17th, Antietam delivered an indecisive Union victory. It was the bloodiest single day in American history and further convinced Palmerston and much of his cabinet that outright conquest of the South was unlikely when news reached them on September 30th. Discussions about mediation peaked at this time. On October 4th, after learning that Napoleon now supported recognizing the Confederacy, Russell urged Palmerston to immediately pursue a mediation plan based on separating North and South. Yet Russell was moving too quickly. While Antietam had not been a decisive Union triumph, it also failed to deliver the major Southern success needed to spark a robust peace party in Washington. For much of Palmerston's cabinet, these remained essential conditions for any mediation effort. When Russell presented a detailed memorandum on October 13th advocating intervention, only Gladstone supported him. The colonial secretary, Newcastle, echoed broader sentiment by arguing that such a proposal was premature. I do not think it will be long before a significant faction in the North opposes the war. Premature intervention by Europe would only prevent such a development and instead unite both factions in a shared, reckless determination to continue fighting. Russell's arguments, however, contained several precarious assumptions. He believed that all 5 major European powers needed to act together, even if Britain and France led the effort. Yet Russian support was uncertain. While Russia had backed Britain during the Trent Affair the previous year, it now appeared, and later confirmed, that it was unwilling to risk its relationship with the Union by threatening recognition of the Confederacy. In light of this uncertainty and Lincoln's clear resolve to continue the war, even Palmerston suggested waiting until after the November elections, hoping that the elusive peace party might finally emerge. Beneath all these considerations lay the issue of slavery. Charles Francis Adams, the American ambassador in London, was appalled by how Confederate agents and their British sympathizers managed to frame the South as underdogs and victims. Even more troubling was their portrayal of mediation as a humanitarian obligation, with little mention of slavery. While there was considerable admiration for the South's aristocratic way of life, no influential figure considered slavery a noble cause, least of all Palmerston, who was one of the most fervent anti-slavery politicians of his time. However, since abolition had not yet been firmly established as a Northern war aim, slavery did not outright preclude mediation. In fact, figures like Russell and Gladstone believed that separating North and South would be the best way to end slavery. Argyle, however, bluntly told Gladstone he was deluding himself with such an idea. Adams's solution to dispel any ambiguity on this issue was to make slavery central to the conflict. Lincoln, however, worried that issuing emancipation without a military victory would appear desperate to foreign observers. Seward described it as our last shriek on the retreat. Antietam finally altered this dynamic. The Union's narrow success at Antietam fell far short of Lincoln's hopes for a decisive victory, leaving Seward cautious. Nonetheless, on September 22nd, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring all slaves in Confederate-held territories free. While this announcement did not immediately shift British policy, many still doubted the South could be conquered. It marked a turning point for the Southern cause. For the remainder of the war, slavery became an albatross around the Confederacy's neck. Some in Britain naively urged the South to abolish slavery themselves as a countermeasure, an idea that was predictably futile. In that year's elections, Republicans retained control of Congress, ensuring that both Lincoln's administration and the Union remained steadfastly committed to pursuing victory in the war. There would be no British-led armistice. The failure of the mediation efforts during the summer and autumn of 1862 stemmed from a variety of factors. Ultimately, the South's inability to secure the kind of decisive victory that could destabilize Lincoln's administration ensured that caution prevailed in both London and Paris. Alternative cotton supplies were sourced from Egypt and India, easing economic pressures. Meanwhile, newspapers could do little more than lament the ongoing bloodshed, as Lincoln's determination to continue the war remained unshaken. Statesmen, for their part, clung to the belief that the South was unconquerable, right up until events proved otherwise. Had Pope's army been utterly destroyed and the Democrats subsequently gained control of the House, mediation would have become unavoidable. In the absence of such developments, however, the prospect of ending the Civil War through diplomacy was always remote. And so, as the cannons fell silent and the dust of battle settled, the world's gaze turned inward, questioning its own role in this bloody chapter of history. What if Britain had risked war to break the Union blockade? What if France had gambled on Confederate independence? Would the map of global power look different today? Or was their hesitation, born of economic pragmatism and moral ambiguity, the very reason they avoided catastrophe? The Civil War was not just a test of America's unity, but a mirror reflecting the fears, ambitions, and contradictions of nations far beyond its shores. Perhaps the most haunting question remains: did the world's inaction shape the war's outcome, or did it simply reveal a deeper truth about humanity's reluctance to act when morality and self-interest collide? The answers are as elusive as they are provocative, leaving us to wonder: did the world react wisely, or did it simply watch history unfold from the sidelines?